Daniel Carter moved like a shadow through the gleaming halls of Stormtech's headquarters. The building was all glass and steel, designed to look untouchable, like the people who owned it. At night, the executives had long since gone home, their luxury cars whisking them back to penthouses high above the city. What remained was silence, save for the soft squeak of Daniel's mop gliding across the marble floors. To most, he was invisible. Just the janitor. A man in gray coveralls who carried buckets instead of briefcases, whose name they never remembered even when they saw him every day. They didn't know that he once carried books, heavy with promise. They didn't know that he once had a different kind of dream. Years ago, Daniel had been a law student. Bright, sharp, one of the few from his neighborhood who had made it into NYU law. Professors saw in him a future attorney who could stand in courtrooms and change lives with his words. But life has a way of testing even the strongest plans. His wife, Angela, was diagnosed with cancer in his second year. In a world that demanded both money and time, Daniel had neither. He left law school and picked up a mop to pay the bills, holding her hand through every chemo session, every long night of pain. And when she passed, he held their daughter Maya and promised her that he would never let her feel alone. That promise became his life. The janitor's job gave him just enough to keep a roof overhead, food on the table, and Maya in school. But when others saw a man resigned to scrubbing toilets and buffing floors, Daniel was still holding on to something they couldn't see. He never stopped learning, never stopped reading. The law books he once studied were now dog-eared and stacked, in boxes under his bed. Each night, when the office halls grew quiet, Daniel would slip into an empty break room, crack open a casebook, and study by the hum of the vending machines. Some nights, the exhaustion nearly broke him. His back ached from hours of labor. His hands smelled of bleach and soap no matter how much he scrubbed them clean. But when he opened those books and traced his finger over the lines of law, he felt alive again, as if he were still sitting in those NYU classrooms, still debating justice, still building the future he had once imagined. He told no one about this, not the supervisors who barked at him to work faster, not the young interns who ignored him as if he were a fixture of the building. Even Maya didn't fully understand. She only knew that her father worked hard, and that every night he would tuck her into bed with words she never forgot. "Baby girl, one day you'll see why I never gave up." There was grief in Daniel's eyes. Yes. The kind of grief that never fades. But there was also fire. Quiet, patient fire. And though the world had pushed him into the shadows, Daniel Carter was not a man content to stay invisible forever. Soon, the halls that once echoed with only the squeak of his mop would resound with his voice, and the world that had dismissed him would have no choice but to listen. The courthouse loomed like a fortress of stone and glass, its tall pillars casting long shadows across the morning pavement. Crowds pressed against the barriers outside, reporters shouting questions into microphones, cameras flashing as though they could capture the truth in a single frame. The city was buzzing with one name, Elena Hayes. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Every seat in the gallery was filled, journalists scribbling in notebooks, investors whispering in worried tones, strangers craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the powerful woman at the center of it all. Elena Hayes, CEO of Stormtech, sat at the defense table, her back straight, her expression unreadable. Her navy suit was flawless, her hair pulled into a tight knot, but even perfection couldn't mask the faint tremor in her hands as she arranged the papers before her. To the world, Elena was untouchable. Her face graced the covers of Forbes and Fortune, celebrated as one of the youngest and most brilliant CEOs in America. But now she sat accused of fraud on a scale so large it could destroy not only her career, but the company she had built from the ground up. The prosecution painted her as greedy, ruthless, willing to forge contracts and manipulate investors. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders, but worse than the charges was the feeling of betrayal. Someone close to her had set this trap. The courtroom buzzed with expectation. The prosecution's lead attorney, Marshall Kent, strode in, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, his gray suit sharp, His hair slicked back. He carried himself like a man certain of victory. When he glanced toward Elena, his smirk made it clear he had already written her downfall in his mind. But it wasn't Marshall who made Elena's pulse quicken. It was the empty chair beside her. That seat was meant for her attorney, a man paid more in a month than most earned in years. Yet when the bailiff called the court to order, the chair remained hauntingly vacant. No briefcase, no counsel, no defense. Whispers erupted in the gallery. "Where's her lawyer? Has she been abandoned?" The reporters scribbled frantically, smelling blood. Elena tried to steady her breathing, but panic threatened to betray her composure. Her attorney had assured her he would be there. Had he been bought off, threatened, or had he simply walked away, leaving her exposed? Judge Walter Harris, silver-haired and keen-eyed, surveyed the courtroom from the bench. "Counsel for the defense?" His voice echoed sharp and demanding. Elena rose slowly, her throat dry. "Your Honor, my attorney." Her voice caught, and she swallowed hard. "He is not present." Gasps rippled through the room. Marshal Kent's smirk widened, the predator scenting easy prey. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "it seems the defense has abandoned even its own client, perhaps because they recognize the futility of her case." Laughter broke out in the gallery, cruel and cutting. Elena clenched her jaw, her heart hammering. For the first time in years, she felt small, alone, vulnerable. From the back of the courtroom, Daniel Carter sat quietly in the gallery, his mop propped beside him like a staff of faded wood and metal. He hadn't meant to be there, not really. He'd slipped in on his morning break, curious, unable to resist witnessing what he knew was a trial laced with lies. He watched as Elena's composure cracked for the briefest second. He saw past the polished armor she wore and glimpsed the fear in her eyes. The same fear he had felt years ago when doctors told him his wife wouldn't make it. The same fear he had seen in Maya when she asked him, "Daddy, what will happen to us now?" Daniel's grip tightened on the mop handle. His heart pounded with a force that drowned out the whispers, the laughter, even the gavel striking for order. He knew what this was. It wasn't just a trial. It was a crucifixion. And in that moment, something deep inside him stirred. He could stay silent, invisible, nothing more than a janitor in the back row. Or he could step forward. The thought frightened him. It thrilled him. It felt impossible. Yet as Elena lowered her gaze, seemingly swallowed by the weight of betrayal, Daniel Carter felt words rising in his chest, too heavy to keep inside. The world was about to hear a voice they had long ignored. The courtroom was a hive of whispers, the sound like the restless buzzing of bees waiting to sting. Judge Harris tapped his gavel sharply, calling for silence, but the tension only thickened. Elena Hayes sat frozen, her eyes fixed on the empty chair beside her. Her lawyer was gone, her defense crumbling before her eyes. She had faced boardrooms, full of men twice her age, stock crashes, media scandals, but never had she felt this exposed. Marshal Kent rose slowly, his smug expression a performance for the crowd. "Your Honor, perhaps this is a sign," he said smoothly, his voice carrying like polished steel. "Even her own legal counsel abandoned her because they know what the evidence will show. Miss Hayes is guilty. This is not a question of if, but when." The gallery erupted in laughter and murmurs. Reporters scribbled, hungry for headlines. Elena's jaw clenched. She refused to cry, but her nails dug into the wooden table hard enough to splinter. And then, like a crack of thunder, splitting the heavy air, a voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "I'll defend her." The words were loud, raw, and filled with something that cut through the sneers like a blade. Every head turned at once. There, standing in the aisle, was Daniel Carter. His mop still leaned against his shoulder, droplets of water falling onto the polished floor. His gray janitor's uniform looked almost comical against the sea of tailored suits and silk dresses. But his face was carved with a determination so fierce that the laughter faltered. The silence lasted only a heartbeat before the room exploded. Who is this man? Is he insane? He's just a janitor. Marshal Kent let out a derisive laugh, clapping his hands together once in mock amusement. Oh, this is rich, he sneered. A janitor defending a CEO in federal court? Your Honor, surely this circus has gone on long enough. The bailiff strode forward, his hand raised. Sir, you're not allowed to stand there. Sit down before I escort you out. But Daniel did not move. He didn't blink. His voice came again, firmer, resonating with something that made the chatter waver. I said I'll defend her. Judge Harris adjusted his glasses, his sharp eyes narrowing on the man who had just disrupted his courtroom. What is your name? Daniel Carter, Your Honor. His voice was steady now, strong, carrying the weight of years no one had cared to see. The judge leaned forward slightly. Mr. Carter, are you the defense attorney for Miss Hayes? Daniel's gaze drifted to Elena. Her wide, stunned eyes met his. For the first time in years, she had no words. She shook her head faintly, disbelief etched across her face. Daniel lifted his chin. No, Your Honor, I'm her janitor, but I know exactly what they're trying to do to her. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Reporters exchanged wild glances, their pens flying. The arrogance that had dominated the air just moments ago shifted into something else. Confusion. Intrigue. Elena's lips parted in shock. You? She whispered, her voice so low only she could hear herself. You're just the janitor. Daniel's eyes burned with a quiet fire. Yes, Miss Hayes, I am the janitor, but I also studied the law, and I will not let them destroy you with lies. The gallery erupted in laughter again, sharper this time, desperate to mock away the unease settling in their chests. But Elena saw it, just for an instant, behind Daniel's calm face, the conviction of a man who had carried burdens heavier than ridicule. Judge Harris tapped his gavel, silencing the chaos. His voice came clear, calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. Mr. Carter, this court does not entertain theatrics. Unless you can present a lawful basis for your statement, I will have you removed. Daniel did not flinch. Slowly, with deliberate care, he leaned his mop against the wall, pulled a thick, worn binder from his satchel, and set it on the table before him. The pages bristled with sticky notes, tabs, and handwritten notes in neat, deliberate script. His voice rang out steady as stone. Your Honor, I may not wear a suit or carry a license, but I know this case inside and out, and I have the evidence to prove Miss Hayes is innocent. The room froze. The laughter evaporated. Even Marshall's smirk faltered. The janitor was not bluffing. The courtroom crackled with disbelief as though Daniel's words had knocked the very air out of the room. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights above, buzzing over marble and wood. Then, like a dam breaking, laughter erupted, loud, cruel, echoing off the high ceilings. Is this a joke? A reporter cackled from the gallery. A janitor with a binder is going to fight a federal prosecutor? Another scoffed. Soft chuckles rippled even from the press benches where seasoned journalists leaned forward with glee, already framing tomorrow's headlines. Marshal Kent, immaculately pressed in his gray suit, waited until the laughter reached its peak before stepping forward, owning the moment. He looked at Daniel with mock pity, then spread his arms toward the judge. Your Honor, he said smoothly, his words dripping with derision, we are truly lowering ourselves to comedy now. Shall we call in the cafeteria staff to join the defense next? Perhaps a security guard to handle cross-examination? Cool. Gallery howled again. Elena's face burned hot, humiliation cutting sharper than the charges against her. She turned sharply toward Daniel, her voice a cold hiss. You're embarrassing me. Sit down before they drag you out. But Daniel didn't move. His hand rested calmly on the binder, his shoulders squared. His voice, though soft, sliced clean through the laughter. Miss Hayes, they're laughing because they think truth only belongs to those with money and suits. But I've studied this case more than anyone in this room, and I won't let them bury you under lies." His words silenced a few chuckles, though scoffs still lingered. Judge Harris adjusted his glasses, his sharp eyes locked on Daniel. "Mr. Carter, this is highly irregular. You are not a licensed attorney. This court cannot allow just anyone to take the floor." Marshall smirked, sensing victory. "Exactly, Your Honor. This man has no right to speak here. He should return to his mop before he hurts himself with those sticky notes." The insult landed, drawing another ripple of cruel laughter. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his composure held. Slowly, he flipped open the binder. The crack of its spine sounded louder than it should have. Inside, the pages were filled with meticulous handwriting, diagrams, printouts, and highlighted documents. Color-coded tabs stuck out like flags of war. He pulled out the first sheet and held it high enough for the jury to see. "This, Daniel," said clearly, his voice steady, "is the contract amendment they claim Miss Hayes signed. And this," he pointed to a section circled in red, "is metadata proving it didn't come from StormTech's servers, but from a rival company in Zurich. I've cross-referenced the timestamps, the IP addresses, and even the template styles. Every detail points away from her and toward those trying to destroy her." The room quieted. Jokes faltered on lips. Reporters leaned forward, pens pausing. Mid-air, Elena, still stunned, turned to look at him more closely. He wasn't flustered, he wasn't shaking. He spoke like a man who had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times. Marshall barked out a laugh to mask his unease. "Metadata? From a janitor?" He sneered. "What's next, Mr. Carter? Are you going to tell us you moonlight as a computer scientist?" Daniel's eyes narrowed, his voice unshaken. "No. I'm going to tell you that I studied law. I was on track to finish at NYU before my wife was diagnosed with cancer. I dropped out to care for her, and after she died, I raised my daughter alone. That's why I clean these halls. But don't think for a second that means I stopped learning. I studied every night for years. And I studied this case the moment I saw the pieces didn't fit." A hush rippled through the room. The jury shifted in their seats, their expressions softening. Even Judge Harris leaned forward, his gaze sharpening with new interest. Marshall's smirk faltered just for a moment. He hadn't expected that. Elena's breath caught. Her cold exterior cracked, replaced by something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. And in the back row, where seconds ago the gallery had laughed, silence began to take root. The janitor wasn't just talking. He was convincing. The laughter had drained from the room, leaving behind a thick, uneasy quiet. For the first time since the trial began, the balance of power shifted. All eyes locked on the janitor who dared to stand where no one expected him to. His weathered binder spread open across the defense table like a weapon. Daniel Carter adjusted the pages with deliberate care, as though every tab, every highlight had been placed for this very moment. His voice carried no arrogance, no pretense, only the calm conviction of a man who had lived too long in silence. "This," he said, holding up a printed contract, "is the so-called amendment to the Ravenmark deal. The prosecution says Miss Hayes approved this document on March 7th at 2:14 p.m. from her office here in New York." He paused, letting the jury lean in, their curiosity now hooked. "But I traced the metadata, and the digital signature was never created here. It originated from Zurich, Switzerland, on a server tied to Alter Holdings, StormTech's chief rival." A murmur spread through the courtroom like a gust of wind. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling furiously, their eyes darting between the binder and the stunned prosecutor. Judge Harris raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. "Mr. Carter, are you saying the document presented by the prosecution is falsified?" Daniel nodded firmly. "Not just falsified, Your Honor. Deliberately planted. Whoever created this amendment wanted it to appear as though Miss Hayes authorized it. But the IP address, the file history, and even the formatting give it away. This wasn't her hand. It was a forgery designed to frame her." Marshall Kent shot up from his seat, his voice sharp with indignation. "Your Honor, this is absurd. The man is a janitor, not a forensic analyst. This so-called evidence is meaningless, without expert verification." Daniel didn't flinch. He slid another page from the binder and laid it on the table, which is why I asked an independent cybersecurity specialist to review my findings. He confirmed every word. The report is, here, signed and sealed. I submitted a copy to the clerk last week just in case. Gasps echoed through the gallery. A wave of whispers rippled across the benches. Marshall's face drained of color, though he forced a sneer to mask it. This is a stunt. Nothing more. Daniel's eyes lifted to meet his. Calm, steady, unshaken. The only stunt here is trying to destroy a woman with fabricated evidence, and I won't let it happen. He turned back to the binder, flipping carefully through the pages. Every sheet was marked with sticky notes in bright colors. Yellow for dates, blue for witness names, red for contradictions. He spoke slowly, clearly so every juror could follow. Here, he said, pointing to one section. The prosecution claims Miss Hayes personally approved the transfer of funds on February 18th, but this log shows she was overseas at a conference. Her passport was stamped in London that very day, her schedule public record. Yet the document says she signed it in New York. That's not just sloppy, it's impossible. Elena Hayes felt her throat tighten. For weeks she had sat helpless, painted as a criminal. But now, listening to Daniel unravel the lies one by one, something stirred inside her chest. A flicker of relief. A flicker of faith. The jury leaned closer, their pens moving, their eyes locked on the janitor in gray. The laughter was gone. Respect was taking its place. Daniel closed the binder gently, resting his hand on its worn cover. Your Honor, I may not wear a suit or carry a degree, but I know what I've found. I know when something doesn't add up, and this case doesn't add up. Miss Hayes is innocent. The evidence proves it. All anyone has to do is look closely. The room was silent, utterly still. Even the bailiff stood frozen as though afraid to break the spell. Judge Harris leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with an expression no one could quite read. Interest, curiosity, perhaps even respect. And somewhere deep inside Elena Hayes, walls she had built over a lifetime began to crack. For the first time since the nightmare began, she felt she was not alone. The janitor wasn't bluffing. He was fighting, and everyone could see it. Marshall Kent rose from his chair like a man preparing to strike a match. His slicked-back hair gleamed under the courtroom lights, and his smirk returned, sharp as a blade. He could feel the tide of the trial shifting, and he hated it. A janitor with a battered binder had just stolen the attention he'd worked years to command. He paced slowly in front of the jury, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. Your Honor, he began with an icy drawl. While this spectacle is entertaining, let's not lose our grip on reality. Mr. Carter is not an attorney. He is not an expert. He is a janitor who wields a mop, not the law. Laughter bubbled up again from the gallery, though softer this time, less certain. Marshall seized it anyway. He turned on Daniel, his words cutting. Tell us, Mr. Carter, why should this court take you seriously when you couldn't even finish law school? Isn't it true you dropped out, failed to make the cut? The jab hung in the air. The jury's eyes flicked back to Daniel. Even Elena stiffened beside him, dreading the answer. This was the moment Marshall wanted, the moment to strip away the janitor's dignity in front of everyone. Daniel's fingers rested on the edge of his binder. He didn't flinch, he didn't lower his gaze. His voice came slow, steady, and raw. Yes, I left law school. Marshall grinned, pouncing. Ah, so you admit it. You couldn't handle the pressure, could you? Daniel's eyes lifted not toward Marshall but toward the jury. His words carried the weight of years he had never spoken aloud. No. I left because my wife was dying. Angela Carter. She was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer during my second year. The doctors gave her 6 months. His voice broke slightly, but he pressed on. I had a choice, continue chasing my degree, while she suffered alone, or hold her hand every day until the end. The room fell into absolute silence. Even Marshall froze, the smirk slipping from his face. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice rough with emotion. I chose to be with her. I cooked for her when she couldn't eat. I held her hair when the chemo made her sick. I read her favorite books aloud until her eyes closed for the last time. And when she passed, I looked into the face of our little girl, our daughter Maya, and I promised her she'd never be alone. A faint gasp escaped from the jury box. One juror pressed a hand against her mouth, eyes glistening. The reporters who had been scribbling furiously now sat frozen, pens hovering in the air. Daniel drew in a shaky breath, his voice steadying. So yes, I became a janitor, because it gave me enough to keep food on the table, keep a roof over our heads, and keep my daughter in school. I traded my dreams for hers, and I would do it again without hesitation. He looked directly at Marshall, his gaze unwavering. So if you want to call me a dropout, go ahead. If you want to mock me for scrubbing floors, go ahead. But don't you dare mistake sacrifice for failure. Because my daughter is alive, she's safe, and she still believes her father stands for something. The silence that followed was unlike any that had come before. It wasn't disbelief. It wasn't ridicule. It was reverence. Elena stared at him, her throat tight, her eyes stinging with something she refused to call tears. This man, this janitor, had endured a pain she could hardly imagine, yet he stood taller than anyone in the room. Judge Harris shifted in his chair, his expression solemn. Mr. Carter, thank you for your honesty. Even Marshall struggled to find his footing. His voice, once so smooth and mocking, sounded brittle when he finally spoke. Tragic story, yes, but irrelevant to... Daniel cut him off, his voice like steel. No, counselor. It is very relevant, because it shows you that I didn't give up on the law. I just had to put my family first, and now I'm here, because I won't let my daughter grow up in a world where justice belongs only to the rich and powerful, not while I still have a voice. The jury leaned forward, captivated. The gallery, once a sea of mockery, sat hushed, and for the first time, Elena's cold, guarded heart cracked wide open. She saw him, not as a janitor, not as a dropout, but as a man who had fought battles no courtroom had ever witnessed. Daniel Carter wasn't just defending her. He was defending the very idea of justice, and the entire room felt it. The air in the courtroom felt different now. The sneers had died, the laughter silenced. What lingered instead was a thick, heavy anticipation, as if everyone sensed they had just witnessed something bigger than testimony. Daniel Carter had revealed not only his sacrifice but his strength, and it had shaken the room to its core. Marshall Kent sat rigid, his jaw tight, his polished confidence showing its first cracks. The jury, once bored and ready to dismiss the janitor, now leaned forward, pens in hand, their eyes fixed on Daniel as though waiting for him to show them what they had missed all along. Daniel adjusted the binder in front of him. The pages were worn, edges frayed, tabs sticking out like the flags of a general's battle plan. His voice came steady, strong, but never rushed. Every pause felt intentional, as though he wanted each word to land with weight. Let's talk about the prosecution's timeline, he began. According to them, Miss Hayes authorized the fraudulent transfer of $50 million on February 18th. They claim her signature was verified and that the funds were approved directly from her office in New York. He lifted a page marked with a bright yellow tab. But here is her travel record. That same day she was in London delivering the keynote address at the Global Tech Summit. The event was live-streamed, time-stamped, and witnessed by thousands. The prosecution would have you believe she somehow signed these documents in New York, while simultaneously standing on stage in London. A murmur rippled through the jury box. Judge Harris raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Daniel flipped to another page, this one highlighted in red. Now let's talk about the format of the so-called contract amendment. StormTech's legal team uses a very specific contract template, always the same headers, spacing, language. But this amendment, the structure is different. The phrasing is European, not American. This isn't StormTech's work. It matches the style of Alter Holdings, a direct competitor. Marshall shot to his feet, his voice cutting. Your Honor, this is speculation. He is not qualified to analyze legal documents. Daniel didn't raise his voice, he didn't have to, which is why I had these documents independently reviewed by an attorney I studied with years ago. He signed an affidavit confirming what I just stated. That affidavit has been entered into the court's record. A collective gasp spread through the gallery. Even reporters stopped writing, stunned. Daniel's tone hardened. This isn't about speculation. This is about patterns. And the pattern points not to Miss Hayes, but to someone inside her own circle who had access to her signature credentials and knew enough about her schedule to set her up. He turned another page, this one marked with a blue tab. He tapped, at once his finger steady. And that person is Paul Graham, Miss Hayes's personal assistant. For years he was her right hand, trusted with every document, every schedule, every password. But just before this trial began, he abruptly resigned. And I have copies of emails showing he was in contact with executives at Alter Holdings during that very time. The room erupted in gasps. Elena's breath caught in her chest. Her mind replayed the last days with Paul, his odd silences, his quick exits, his vague excuses. She felt her stomach twist. Marshall's voice cracked as he tried to salvage control. Your Honor, these claims are outrageous. This man is spinning conspiracies from scraps of paper. But Daniel's eyes locked on him with calm fire. Scraps of paper? Or the truth you've ignored because you assumed no one would dig deep enough? You underestimated me, Mr. Kent. Just like you underestimated Miss Hayes. Just like the world underestimates every janitor, every so-called nobody who works in the shadows. But shadows see everything. A chill swept through the gallery. The words rang too true to dismiss. Elena turned slowly to look at Daniel. For the first time in weeks, she felt something break through the hopelessness. It wasn't just defense. It was light. A man she had barely noticed until now was dismantling the lies with precision and courage, piece by piece. Judge Harris leaned forward, his gaze sharp. Mr. Carter, if what you are alleging about this assistant is true, then this court will need immediate verification. Do you have further evidence? Daniel placed a flash drive on the table. Yes, Your Honor. Communications I retrieved from discarded documents and electronic records. Enough to prove Paul Graham was in collusion with Alter Holdings to frame Miss Hayes. Every message, every transfer, every betrayal, it's all here. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Marshall Kent seemed, for the first time, at a loss for words. And in that silence, the courtroom began to see Daniel Carter not as a janitor, not as a dropout, not as a man out of place, but as the defender of truth. The gavel struck, signaling a short recess, but no one moved right away. The gallery buzzed in hushed tones. The jury whispered among themselves, and reporters scrambled to send updates that would ignite headlines before the hour was out. The janitor with the mop had just put cracks in the prosecution's case, and the world beyond the courthouse walls was already hungry for the story. Daniel Carter sat back, his binder still open, his hands resting on its worn cover. For the first time since he'd stood and declared he would defend Elena Hayes, the weight of what he'd done began to press against him. His heart pounded. He had stepped far outside his world of silence and shadows, and though he stood taller than ever before, the enormity of it threatened to crush him. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, when a soft voice called from the back of the courtroom. Daddy. His eyes snapped open. There, slipping through the side door with cautious steps, was Maya, his daughter, 11 years old, with her mother's delicate eyes and his steady jawline. She wore her school uniform still, a navy cardigan and plaid skirt, her backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. She shouldn't have been there. She should have been in class laughing with her friends. Yet here she was, small and brave in the cavernous courtroom. The bailiff stepped forward. Miss, you can't... But Daniel rose quickly, his voice gentle but firm. It's okay, that's my daughter. Maya walked down the aisle, her shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. Whispers rose in the gallery as curious eyes followed her. She stopped in front of Daniel, her head tilted back to look up at him. Her voice was quiet, but it carried enough for the room to hear. Daddy, you're shaking. Daniel's throat tightened. He hadn't realized it, but his hands trembled ever so slightly, betraying the nerves he fought so hard to bury. He crouched down, meeting her at eye level. I'm fine, baby, he whispered. Go on home now. I'll be back soon. But Maya didn't move. She reached out, placing her small hand over his. Mom would be proud of you. Her words were clear, steady, and full of a child's fierce sincerity. The room hushed. Even the murmurs faded into silence. Daniel's eyes burned as he swallowed hard, holding her gaze. Maya wasn't just his daughter. She was the promise he had lived for after everything else was stripped away. She was the reason he worked nights, the reason he kept studying when exhaustion told him to quit. And here she was, standing before him, giving him the strength he hadn't realized he needed. From the defense table, Elena Hayes watched the scene unfold. Something inside her shifted as she looked at the girl and then back at the man who had risked everything for her. She had once believed loyalty was a currency to be bought, respect something earned only by power. But this father kneeling before his daughter, drawing strength not from ambition but from love, this was loyalty in its purest form. Maya's voice came again, soft but unyielding. Don't be afraid, Daddy. You always told me the truth is stronger than lies. So don't let them scare you. Daniel smiled faintly through the sting of tears. He pressed a kiss to her forehead and whispered, Thank you, Maya. Now go wait. Outside with Mrs. Jenkins, okay? She nodded, clutching his hand one last time before turning. The bailiff escorted her gently to the back, but her words lingered like a flame inside him. When Daniel straightened again, the tremor was gone. His hands were steady. His voice, when he spoke to the judge, carried with renewed strength. Your Honor, I'm ready to continue. And for the first time, Elena Hayes believed him. Not because of the binder, not because of the evidence, but because she had just witnessed the core of his strength. It wasn't pride, or ego, or even revenge. It was love. And love, she realized, was more powerful than any weapon his enemies could wield. When the recess ended and the jury filed back into their seats, the atmosphere inside the courtroom had changed. The mockery was gone. The whispers had turned into hushed anticipation. Everyone leaned forward, waiting, not for the polished prosecutor, but for the janitor in gray who had turned the trial upside down. Marshal Kent knew it. He could feel control slipping through his fingers like water. But if there was one thing Marshall thrived on, it was pressure. He smoothed his tie, squared his shoulders, and rose with the swagger of a man who still believed he owned the room. Your Honor, he said, his voice loud, sharp. I will not allow this court to be misled by half-truths and amateur theatrics. If Mr. Carter believes he has studied enough to play lawyer, then let him answer me. Clearly, precisely, and without hiding behind emotional stories. He turned to Daniel, his eyes gleaming with challenge. Let's see if the janitor can stand against a prosecutor. A murmur swept through the gallery. Cameras clicked. All eyes locked on Daniel. Daniel rose slowly, calm and deliberate, his binder in hand. His face betrayed no fear. He had faced hospital rooms where machines screamed his wife's last breaths. He had faced nights of wondering how he would feed his child. What could Marshal Kent throw at him that he hadn't already endured? Marshall wasted no time. He strode into the center of the aisle, his voice dripping with contempt. Mr. Carter, do you even know the basic principle of admissibility of evidence? Or did you simply print things off the internet and scribble sticky notes like a college student cramming for finals? Laughter rippled faintly, but it died when Daniel answered, his tone clear, unflinching. Federal Rule of Evidence 901 requires that evidence be authenticated before it can be admitted, which is why I provided, not just the metadata, but a sworn affidavit from an independent cybersecurity specialist verifying the digital trail. That affidavit is already filed with the clerk. Marshall's smirk faltered just for a breath. But he pushed on, voice louder now, as if volume could overpower reason. And what of the supposed emails you claim to have recovered? We know they weren't fabricated by you. Someone with no credentials, no oversight, no authority. Daniel turned a page in his binder. holding it up for the judge and jury, because the emails were retrieved from Paul Graham's secondary device, the one he left in his desk at StormTech. I didn't hack it. I didn't steal it. As a custodian, I am authorized to clean every office in that building. That device was left unsecured. And the moment I saw its contents, I secured them and sent copies to an investigative journalist who verified their origin. Those findings, too, are before this court. The jury leaned forward, visibly struck. Even Judge Harris nodded slightly, impressed with the precision. Marshall clenched his jaw. His polished rhythm was cracking. He took a step closer, his voice sharp. So tell us, Mr. Carter, what qualifies you, a janitor, to interpret contracts and corporate law? Surely this is nothing more than wishful thinking. Daniel let the silence stretch for a moment. Then, with quiet power, he spoke. What qualifies me is the same thing that should qualify anyone in this courtroom: the truth. I may mop floors, but I also studied law until life tore me from it. And I never stopped learning. I never stopped fighting for the idea that justice shouldn't belong only to those who can afford it. If that makes me unqualified, then perhaps we've all forgotten what justice is meant to be. The words landed heavy. The jury's eyes softened. The gallery erupted in murmurs, not of laughter this time, but of agreement. Marshall's face flushed, his composure slipping. He opened his mouth to strike again, but the judge raised his hand sharply. That's enough, counselor. Mr. Carter has answered your questions with clarity. Let us proceed with the evidence. Daniel closed his binder gently, his hand steady as stone. Across the table, Elena Hayes stared at him, her breath caught in her chest. She had come into this courtroom, abandoned, betrayed, alone, but now, watching the janitor dismantle the prosecutor with truth and courage, she felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in years: trust. Marshall Kent sat back down, his jaw clenched, his pen snapping in his grip. For the first time in his career, he realized he was losing not to a rival attorney, but to the very man he had dismissed as nothing. And Daniel Carter, the janitor, stood taller than anyone in the room. The courtroom had gone still again, as though the very walls were leaning in to listen. The jury watched Daniel Carter with wide eyes, the gallery silent, and even Judge Harris sat back in his chair, studying the man who refused to bend. Marshall Kent seethed at his table, scribbling furiously, but the air was no longer his to control. Daniel stood with his binder closed, his hand resting on it as though it held not just evidence, but the weight of his life. He looked around the room, his eyes moving from juror to the judge, then to Elena Hayes, who stared at him with a mixture of disbelief and dawning faith. For a moment he seemed to hesitate. Then his voice rose, steady but raw, carrying the trembling truth of a man laying his soul bare. I need to say something, Daniel began, his tone quieter than before, yet more piercing than any cross-examination, not as a janitor, not as a failed law student, but as a man who has lived with fear for far too long. He paused, swallowing hard. His eyes flicked toward the back of the room, where he knew Maya waited in the hallway with Mrs. Jenkins. Every night, after I finish mopping floors in your offices, I go home and tuck my daughter into bed, and every night she asks me the same question: Daddy, are we safe? She's 11 years old, but she already knows what it feels like to live in a world where the powerful bend the truth, and the rest of us just have to survive it. Words landed like stones in a still pond, ripples spreading through the room. Daniel's voice thickened, emotion edging past his careful restraint. I've been afraid too all these years, afraid that my daughter would grow up thinking the law only works for the rich, afraid that she would believe her father never fought back, afraid that the silence I kept because I was just a janitor would teach her to be silent too. He drew in a breath, and his shoulders lifted, strong and unyielding now. But when I saw what they were trying to do to Miss Hayes, I knew I couldn't stay quiet anymore. I couldn't look at my daughter and tell her to believe in truth if I wasn't willing to risk everything for it. So yes, I may stand here without a law degree, without a suit, without a title, but I will stand here anyway. Because I would rather, My daughter see me fall for speaking the truth and live safe and silent while justice is stolen in front of our eyes. The silence in the courtroom was electric, pulsing. Several jurors shifted, their eyes shining. Even a few reporters lowered their pens as though afraid to interrupt the moment with scratching ink. Daniel's voice softened, but the conviction in it burned hotter. I may be a single dad, a janitor, a man the world forgot, but I know the truth. And I will not let my daughter grow up believing that truth belongs only to men in suits with power. It belongs to all of us, and I will defend it. For her, for Miss Hayes, for every person who has ever been told they don't matter. His words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. Then it happened. A sound not of laughter or scoffs, but of quiet applause. It began in the back, hesitant, then grew as more hands joined, echoing against the wooden benches. The bailiff barked for order, but the emotion couldn't be contained. The gallery no longer looked at Daniel as a joke. They looked at him as something else entirely. Courage made flesh. Elena Hayes's throat tightened. She had spent her entire life believing strength was power, believing survival meant standing alone. But in this moment, watching Daniel Carter bare his soul, she understood she had been wrong. Strength wasn't about walls, it was about truth, about sacrifice, about love. And this janitor, this father, was the strongest man she had ever met. When the applause finally faded and silence returned, Judge Harris leaned forward, his voice steady but warmer than before. Mr. Carter, proceed. Daniel bowed his head, respectfully. When he looked up again, his hands no longer shook, his voice no longer trembled. He had laid his heart before them all, and instead of breaking him, it had set him free. The janitor was no longer invisible. The morning sun poured through the tall courthouse windows, streaking the wood and marble with bands of light. It felt almost symbolic, as though the dawn itself had come to witness the final chapter of a battle no one had expected. The gallery was overflowing, every seat filled, reporters packed shoulder to shoulder, cameras flashing from the corridor beyond. The world was waiting for a verdict, not just on Elena Hayes, but on the janitor who had stood and shaken the foundation of the trial. Daniel Carter sat quietly at the defense table, his binder closed before him. He hadn't slept the night before. He had sat in his modest apartment with Maya asleep in her room, staring out the window at the city lights, asking himself over and over if he had done enough, if he had risked everything only to fall short. But now, as the jurors filed back into the box, he didn't feel fear anymore, only calm. He had spoken the truth. Whatever came next, he could look his daughter in the eyes knowing he had not stayed silent. Elena sat beside him, her posture poised as always, but her hands clasped tightly in her lap betrayed her nerves. She glanced sideways at Daniel, and, for the first time, there was no distance in her eyes, no guarded armor, just gratitude, and something deeper she wasn't ready to name. Judge Harris's gavel struck once. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with clear, steady eyes, rose slowly, holding the folded paper. The room held its breath as she handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. Harris unfolded it, scanning the words before nodding gravely. Please read your verdict aloud. The foreperson's voice rang out, calm and resolute. In the matter of the United States versus Elena Hayes, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on all counts. The words detonated in the room like a thunderclap. Gasps, shouts, the shuffle of feet, the click of cameras firing in rapid bursts. Reporters leapt to their feet, rushing for their phones. The gallery erupted, voices clashing in disbelief and celebration. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled in her eyes as she bowed her head, her body trembling with relief she had never allowed herself to feel. She turned to Daniel, and before she could stop herself, she grabbed his hand in both of hers. You saved me, she whispered, her voice breaking. Daniel shook his head softly. No. The truth saved you. I just wouldn't let it stay buried. Across the aisle, Marshal Kent sat frozen, his face pale with fury, his perfect record shattered, his arrogance gutted. He gathered his papers with jerky motions, refusing to look at Daniel as he stormed out. But the defeat clung to him like a shadow he would never shake. At the back of the courtroom, Maya slipped inside just in time to hear the verdict. Her eyes widened, and a radiant smile spread across her face. She clapped her hands once before clasping them to her chest, watching her father with pride so pure it brought tears to Elena's eyes. Judge Harris raised his gavel again, waiting for silence. That took nearly a full minute to return. When it did, his voice came steady, resonant. This court has seen something rare, something we too often forget. Justice is not the property of titles or wealth or status. Justice belongs to the truth, and it belongs to those brave enough to speak it. Mr. Carter, though you hold no license, your courage and preparation have reminded us all what this institution stands for. Let the record show that this case has been decided fairly and rightly. Applause erupted again, but this time it wasn't just the gallery. Jurors clapped. Even court staff joined in. It wasn't celebration for Elena alone. It was for the man who had stood where no one believed he belonged and proven that courage knows no uniform. Daniel Carter closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound wash over him. For once, he wasn't invisible. For once, the world saw him. Not as a janitor, not as a dropout, not as a man bowed by tragedy, but as someone who stood and made a difference. And in the quiet glance he shared with his daughter at the back of the courtroom, he knew the real verdict wasn't in the papers or the applause. It was in her eyes, shining with the unshakable belief that her father had become her hero. The courthouse steps were a storm of flashing cameras and shouted questions, reporters swarming like bees around Elena Hayes as she emerged into the bright afternoon light. Security guards pressed forward to shield her, but she paused, her hand still clutching Daniel Carter's arm as though she couldn't bear to let go. She had walked into that building days ago as a woman condemned, abandoned by her own lawyer, and she was walking out free because a janitor refused to stay silent. Miss Hayes, what's your response to the verdict? Do you consider yourself vindicated? Who is the man beside you? Is he your new counsel? Elena ignored them all. She turned to Daniel, and in full view of the world, she placed her hand over his, steady and sure. This man, she said loudly enough for the crowd to hear, is the reason truth won today, and I will never forget it. Daniel's cheeks burned. He wasn't used to attention, not like this. For years he had lived in the background, cleaning offices while others made headlines. Now hundreds of cameras pointed at him, his daughter, watching from the crowd with wide, shining eyes. He gave Elena a small nod, his voice low. I didn't do it for recognition. I did it because it was right. And that, Elena said, her voice firm and clear, is exactly why you deserve recognition. Inside the quiet of her town car minutes later, away from the chaos outside, Elena finally let her composure slip. She turned to Daniel, her eyes wet, her voice trembling in a way it never had in boardrooms or interviews. I was ready to give up. I thought no one cared enough to stand by me. And then you, of all people, you stood. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his binder on his lap, its edges frayed. I didn't plan it, I just couldn't watch them bury you. Not when I knew the truth. Elena studied him for a long moment, the silence stretching. For years she had built walls around herself, believing trust was weakness, believing loyalty came only through contracts. But here was a man who had none of those things, no power, no wealth, no title, and yet he had given her something far greater, his courage. She took a breath, her voice steadier now. Daniel, I don't want this to be the end. I need you at StormTech, not as a janitor, but as something more. As someone who will keep us honest, who will never let us forget what justice means. Will you come work with me? As our legal and ethics advisor. Daniel blinked, stunned. For a moment he thought he had misheard her. Me? Elena, I don't have a degree. I'm not qualified. You're more qualified than half the men I've paid millions to. Elena cut in, firmly. Because you care, because you fight, because you see people, not just numbers. That's what StormTech needs now. That's what I need. Daniel's throat tightened. He thought of Maya, of the nights she'd fallen asleep at the kitchen table waiting for him to come home, of the questions she asked about justice, of the pride in her eyes that morning. He imagined her walking through Stormtech's doors not as the daughter of a janitor, but as the daughter of a man who stood tall when it mattered most. Finally, he nodded slowly, a smile breaking through his exhaustion. If it means I can keep fighting for the truth, for people like you, for my daughter, then yes, I'll do it. Elena's lips curved into something rare and genuine. Good. Because from this day forward, Daniel Carter, you're not just Stormtech's custodian, you're its conscience. Weeks later, the company's lobby bustled with new life. The trial had ended, but the ripple of its outcome continued. Stormtech had not only survived, it was reborn, stronger and cleaner than before. And at its core stood two people, an untouchable CEO and a single dad who once mopped the floors, now partners in rebuilding a culture of integrity. Daniel's office was modest, his desk piled with papers and law books. Maya sat across from him, sketching ideas for the future on a notepad, her laughter filling the room. Elena appeared at the door, her eyes softening as she watched them. She no longer saw Daniel as the invisible man pushing a mop. She saw him as the man who had defended her when no one else would, the man who reminded her that truth, courage, and love were stronger than any lie. One evening, as the sun set behind the skyline, Daniel stood with Elena at the top floor of Stormtech, overlooking the city that had once ignored him. His daughter's laughter echoed down the hall, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt complete. You know, Elena said quietly, her gaze on the horizon, history won't remember me as the CEO who was accused. They'll remember you, the janitor who stood up when no one else would. Daniel smiled faintly, his voice steady. Maybe, but all I care about is that my daughter remembers me as the man who never gave up. Elena's eyes softened, her voice warm. She will. We all will. And in that golden silence, the world seemed to pause, as if acknowledging that a single act of courage had changed everything. Not just for a CEO, not just for a company, but for a father, his daughter, and everyone who had ever been told they didn't matter. The janitor had become the defender, the single dad had become the hero, and the story of Daniel Carter had only just begun.